An Introduction to Social Policy by Dr. Nick Wilmore. The second part, in which I try to define what social policy is. Welcome to the second part of my Introduction to Social Policy. In this clip, I'm going to be looking at different definitions of social policy and trying to describe how it fits into the way that modern society sets out the relationship between government and its citizens. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to be looking at what other commentators have said about social policy. So in trying to describe social policy, I will be focusing very much on the different perspectives that academics have of what social policy is. So I'm going to start off with Professor Taylor Gooby, who some of you might know is a professor down in Kent. He talked about social policy as being a field of study rather than a discipline. That unlike, for instance, physics, which has a very definite, neat boundaries, social policy is a much wider range of concepts. It is not as precise, and it covers quite a range of almost subgenres within it, and it makes it much more a collection of ideas rather than something that's quite specific and defined. So social policy, he says, focuses on human need, that it's very much on what government and other bodies can do to meet the needs of its citizens. If I then move to Aravachik, who writes from Turkey, he talks about social policy ensuring the welfare of individuals through a range of legislative regulations, whether that be, in UK terms, acts of parliament or statutory instruments. He says that social policy is affected by social developments, that it is constantly in flux, and that the state has a responsibility to set out new regulations as those needs change. And then Kajdin, again referring to governmental and legislative efforts to change society or a particular segment of society. And I think this is the interesting bit, because he's now starting to focus on the idea that it's not just you work at all society or an individual, but actually that you may want to work around a particular segment. And in that sense, you might look at people with disabilities, you might look at people from a particular ethnic or cultural background. And as such, it is socially defined. It is a social intervention. The next couple of slides are going to be looking at some people that try to pull some of those concepts together. So I've started off with looking at Herrick, who talks about social policy as being how a society responds to social problems. Albeit, I think we need to see that idea of social problems in its widest sense. And I think I might be inclined to interpret that not as problems as in a difficulty, but rather a range of needs and opportunities as well as challenges. Herrick recognised that, particularly as I talked about earlier, with the move away from the idea that the public sector is the driver of all service delivery, that we start talking about corporations, and I think he really means incorporated organisations, whether that be a company or a charity, and that it includes not-profit organisations as well, and that these are developing policies that affect their customers and those who use the services. And in that sense, recognising that, for instance, social media organisations like Twitter or Facebook have an element of social policy formulation within the work that they are doing. So you might argue that in the way that they shape their understanding of privacy and the ability to voice the idea of free speech, they are creating an international perspective of social policy. That Herrick recognised social policies affect society and has a direct impact on human behaviour. And I think we all recognise that a policy change can quite negatively impact on individuals, and that then creates a response. Social workers need to have a commitment to the principles of social justice, and that in turn will then have an impact on the policies that relate to their practice and the lives of the people they work with. So you know yourself that the BASWA Code of Ethics actually has an expectation that social workers will advocate for the individual, and they will advocate within society for the needs of the people they work with. And that's part of this interplay that Herrick is setting out. So I've talked about the concept of social policy as being the response of governments to the needs of a society and of its citizens. So what does that response look like? So I've now returned to Peter Taylor-Gooby, who set out where social policy really started in modern times in the UK. So he talked about it being health services, and healthcare has certainly been an issue that has shaped various governments over the last few decades, with a very clear understanding that the concept of a free healthcare service is hugely politically supported in the community, but recognising that there are opportunities for doing it in a different way, trying to respond to the needs as they appear at any particular point in time. There is a very big discussion around personal social services and social care, and the concept of should that be personally funded by the individual or their families, or is it something that as a society we should be underwriting through taxation. That we talked about housing, and over the last 70 years there have been massive changes in the way that housing policy has been viewed, but always that underlying challenge around homelessness. They talk about cash benefits and pensions, and in that we're talking about welfare support, whether you try and meet the needs by a very granular system with multiple benefits, or whether you try, as has been more recently with the idea of universal credit, the idea that you can set out bands for that level of support. Different approaches to education, and the concept of whether that should be a comprehensive approach, whether it needs to be tiered, how you address the needs of excluded groups within that. And within all of that, social policy is looking at how does the government set out through its policy making its intentions, and how does it set out the regulations, because ultimately that is the detail where the devil lies, and the financing and support behind those policies. Because we all know that a policy without appropriate regulations and finances isn't going to go anywhere. So that was Peter Taylor-Gooby. If I look now at Paul Spicker from Aberdeen, he looked at the principal areas of social policy, and he talked again about social services, including health administration, social security, all those things that we've already mentioned. But he took it a little bit further and started talking about some of the social problems that we identify in society, whether that's through crime, whether that's the impact of disability, whether it's unemployment, and the other excluded groups that you see there. He also looked at whether it should relate to social disadvantage, and therefore included some of the protected characteristics we recognise around race, around gender, but also taking it a bit further and actually recognising poverty, access to the labour market, and economic assets. So this is now starting to move on to a debate that's in 2021 we're just beginning to hear now about. Actually, should underlying poverty be recognised as an area of disadvantage alongside race, gender, sexuality, age, religion, and so on. And what he's recognising here is that there's a range of collective social responses to these conditions. And I think it is important, that last phrase, because what it's doing is it's recognising that social policy is a collective response rather than an individual one. So a collective response would be setting out a school's meals programme that addresses the needs of disadvantaged children, whereas an individual response would be Marcus Rashford and his campaign for meals provisions during the school holidays, which is very much an individual response, albeit informed by his disagreement with the social policy currently in place, and will ultimately result in a review and potentially changes to that national social policy being put forward by the government. Having defined social policy as being the way that the contract is set out between a government or leadership and its community in a range of different spheres that affect the lives of individuals, I'm now going to start in the next clip to look at how we start developing that social policy.